Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. We're going to be taking a look at some really interesting research and articles on a topic that's, I think, top of mind for a lot of people right now.
Well,
Large language models, those LLMs you hear about, and then these maybe lesser known, but also incredibly important small language models, or
yeah,
SLMs.
it's a fascinating area. And, when you think about it, the sheer scale of some of these LLMs is, well, it's almost impossible to grasp. Trillions of parameters.
Yeah.
But one of the really interesting things we found is that smaller can actually sometimes be better.
Right. It's about using the right tool for the job.
Exactly.
And so today we're going to break down LLMs versus SLMs, how they work, and what makes them so valuable in the business world.
We'll look at when you might choose something like, ChatGPT, which I'm sure everyone's heard of by now,
Yeah.
versus maybe something called Mistral 7B, a small language model, and the different use cases for each.
Perfect. So let's just jump right in. What are LLMs and SLMs? What makes them tick?
Well, I mean, the most obvious difference is size, right?
Yeah.
LLMs, these are the big guys, billions, even trillions of parameters, trained on enormous amounts of data. And they can do a lot, but that power comes at a cost. They require a ton of computational resources.
Ah, so they're a bit power hungry.
You could say that.
And then on the other side, we have the SLMs.
Right, much leaner, more focused, trained on data that's specific to the task they're designed for, which makes them super efficient.
So LLMs are like the Swiss Army knife of AI, while SLMs are more like a specialized tool.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And just like you wouldn't use a Swiss Army knife to, say, chop down a tree, you wouldn't always use an LLM for something a smaller model could handle just as well.
Makes sense. Now, I was reading about Google's PaLM, a massive LLM with, get this, 540 billion parameters, and it uses something called the Pathways system.
Yeah, Pathways is Google's way of dealing with the huge computational demands of these massive models.
So how does it work?
It's kind of like having a team of specialized workers all contributing to a single project,
Oh,
each handling a specific part of the computation.
okay.
This distributed approach allows PaLM to do things that would be impossible for just a single processor to handle.
Wow, that's impressive. So we've got these powerful models, but how do we actually use them? How do we talk to them?
That's where prompting comes in. It's
Yeah.
the language we use to instruct these models, to tell them what we want them to do.
Okay, so like giving someone directions.
Exactly. You need to be clear and specific to get the desired outcome.
Now, ChatGPT can answer questions on almost any topic. I've seen it myself.
It's amazing, right?
How does it do that? Does someone actually have to program all that knowledge into it?
That's the beauty of these models. They don't need to be specifically programmed with all this knowledge. They learn from the massive amounts of data they're trained on.
Interesting.
They see patterns and relationships within the data, allowing them to answer your questions even if they've never encountered that specific question before.
So it's like they develop an understanding of the world through this data.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And it can be a very deep and nuanced understanding.
But they're still just machines.
Right, exactly. They're not thinking or feeling like humans do. They're incredibly good at pattern recognition and prediction.
Okay, so they're tools, and like any tool, they need to be used correctly to get the best results. Which brings us to the idea of tuning and customization.
Exactly. Both LLMs and SLMs can be refined even further to become even better at specific tasks or for specific domains.
So it's like tailoring a suit.
Yeah, you start with a general pattern, but then you adjust it for that perfect fit. So you might fine-tune a model to be great at analyzing, say, legal documents or maybe medical research.
So we can customize them for our specific needs.
Exactly. And this ability to customize is a big part of why LLMs and SLMs are so valuable for businesses.
Now, fine-tuning sounds like it could be pretty resource-intensive.
It can be.
Is there a way to customize these models without having to completely retrain them? I read about something called parameter-efficient tuning methods, or PTMs.
Yeah, those are really interesting. PTMs offer a way to modify a model's behavior without changing its fundamental structure.
So it's more like tweaking the settings on a machine rather than rebuilding the whole thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so to recap, we've got our LLMs, the versatile ones.
The all-rounders.
And then the SLMs are specialists.
Right.
We communicate with them through prompting, and we can tailor them through fine-tuning or these cool PTMs.
Yeah, it's amazing how far things have come.
It really is. But let's get into some real-world uses now. What can these models actually do for businesses, and how can our listeners start to use them?
Well, let's start with SLMs. They're really good at things like automating those basic customer service questions. translating commonly used phrases, even summarizing short documents.
So like the everyday tasks.
Yeah, the workhorses of the AI world.
Okay, and then what about LLMs?
LLMs, they're the ones you want for those more complex, creative tasks. The things that need a deeper level of understanding. They can generate different kinds of creative text formats, translate languages, write different kinds of creative content, and even answer your questions in an informative way.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is. But it's important to remember, these are still just machines. They're tools that we need to learn to use effectively.
Well, this has been fascinating, but I'm really curious to dive into some real-world examples to hear about how LLMs and SLMs are being used across different industries.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's where it gets really interesting. So stay tuned for our next session where we'll get into all of that.
Awesome. Can't wait.
And, that brings us to another really cool thing about these models. The fact that they can actually generalize, go beyond just the data they were trained on.
So it's not just like regurgitating facts.
Yeah.
It's applying knowledge in new situations.
Right. Even coming up with, novel ideas.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is. And it's one of the big differences between these models and those, old school rule-based systems.
Yeah, I was watching this YouTube video about LLMs, and they had this great analogy. They compared traditional programming to trying to train a cat.
Okay, I like where this is going.
So imagine you had to code every single detail about a cat, its type, how many legs it has, fur or no fur, all its preferences.
Right, it'd be a nightmare.
And that's basically how traditional programming worked.
Very rigid. You needed specific instructions for every single scenario.
Right. But then neural networks came along, and it was more like showing the network pictures of cats and dogs and saying, okay, figure out the difference.
So it could learn on its own without needing all those rules.
Exactly. And now with these generative models, it's like you can just ask it, what is a cat? And it tells you everything it knows based on all that training data.
It's a whole different way of approaching programming and problem solving.
It really is. But let's talk a little more about the different types of LLMs, because I know from the research that they each require different prompting techniques.
Yeah, that's super important. It's like speaking different dialects.
Right. So the sources talk about three main types: generic language models, instruction-tuned models, and dialogue-tuned models.
Okay.
Let's start with the generic ones. What are they all about?
Think of them as the foundation. They're really good at predicting the next word in a sequence based on all the patterns they've learned.
So like autocomplete, but on a massive scale.
Exactly. They can generate text that flows naturally, but they might not always be the best at specific tasks.
Okay, so that's where instruction-tuned models come in.
Right. These guys are trained to follow instructions, so you might give them a prompt like, summarize this article in 3 bullet points, or write a poem in the style of Shakespeare.
So more task-oriented.
Precisely.
And then dialogue-tuned models.
Those are the ones optimized for conversations, trained on those back-and-forth interactions, perfect for things like chatbots or virtual assistants.
Yeah, one source even mentioned that dialogue-tuned models often work better with natural question-like phrasing.
Right. It's more like having a casual conversation.
Not like you're giving a robot commands.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp on the different types of LLMs and how to talk to them, but let's get practical now.
We'll do it.
We've touched on some examples, in customer service, content creation, but I'm curious about specific industries.
Yeah.
One of the articles from the Microsoft Cloud blog had a great breakdown of SLM and LLM use cases across different sectors. So maybe we can start with SLMs since they're good for those everyday tasks.
Absolutely. So think about things like automating those basic customer service questions, translating common phrases, maybe short sentences, identifying emotions or opinions in text, even summarizing short documents.
So really streamlining those tasks.
Yeah, making things more efficient.
Okay, that's great. And then for the more complex stuff, we bring in the LLMs.
Right. They can handle those bigger challenges. They can, generate and analyze code, retrieve complex information, even synthesize text-to-speech with really natural intonation, generate, long scripts, stories, articles, all kinds of stuff.
One source, the blog post on Splunk, had some interesting use cases talking about how LLMs can analyze trends in consumer behavior from huge data sets to, help businesses with their strategies.
It's amazing what they can do with all that data.
And then things like translating technical documents, classifying emails, even generating boilerplate code.
It's incredible. And In the medical field, they're using LLMs to figure out treatment options from all this data.
Yeah.
And in finance, they can process those complex financial reports, give insights for investment decisions.
Wow, it seems like the possibilities are endless.
They really are.
And I think a big part of that is the development of these more efficient training and customization methods, like we talked about, fine-tuning in those PTMs. But there's also that other technique, knowledge distillation.
Right, knowledge distillation.
Can you remind us how that works?
Yeah, so imagine you have this brilliant professor who knows so much, but they can't teach every single student.
Right.
So they write a textbook, putting all their knowledge into it, and then the students can learn from the textbook.
So are you saying with LLMs and SLMs, it's about transferring knowledge from a big model to a smaller one?
Exactly. Taking all that wisdom of an LLM and distilling it into an SLM that's, easier to use and more cost-effective.
That's a really clever way to make those specialized models.
It is. It's really impressive what they're doing.
This is all so fascinating, but I think it's also important to think about the bigger picture here.
Definitely.
These models are getting so sophisticated, it really starts to blur the lines between what humans can do and what machines can do.
You're right. It raises some big questions.
What happens when machines can do the jobs that humans used to do?
Yeah. How will that affect jobs, the economy?
Exactly. And even, how we see ourselves.
It's a really important conversation to be having.
Some people think that AI will just enhance what humans can do.
Right. Free us up to focus on more creative work.
But then others worry about job losses, if machines can do more and more tasks.
It's a complex issue. No easy answers.
Absolutely. But we need to be thinking about it, especially with AI advancing so quickly.
We do. And it's not just the economic side of it.
Right. There are societal implications, too.
Exactly. As these models get more powerful, we need to make sure they're being used responsibly.
One of the sources, an article from the Association for Computing Machinery, talked about how important it is to have diversity and inclusion in AI development.
That's so crucial, making sure everyone feels welcome to contribute to this field.
And then ethical considerations, too.
Right, like the ACM Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct.
So we need to make sure these technologies are being used for good, for everyone's benefit.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point, transparency.
Okay, yeah, because as these models become more complex, it gets harder to understand how they actually work.
Right, and that can be a problem if people don't trust the systems, if they don't know how they're making decisions.
Yeah, one of the Splunk blog posts mentioned that LLMs can sometimes be less transparent than SLMs because they're so big and complex.
It's true, and that lack of transparency can make it hard to fix problems or build trust.
So we need to make sure we understand these models, how they work, so we can use them responsibly.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about all the great things LLMs and SLMs can do, but what about their limitations?
Right, they're not perfect.
What are some of the challenges?
Well, one of the biggest ones is making sure they're robust and reliable.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, they can make mistakes, especially if they encounter something unexpected, something outside of their training data.
Ah, so they're not invincible?
Not quite. The Splunk blog post talked about how important it is to, thoroughly test these models to make sure they're working properly.
Makes sense. So we can't just blindly trust them.
No, not yet. Another thing is what they call hallucination.
Hallucination. That sounds a little scary.
Well, it's basically when the models generate outputs that are, factually incorrect or just totally made up.
Oh, wow. That could be a problem.
It can be, especially if you're using them for something like medical diagnosis or giving legal advice.
So it's important to remember they're still under development.
Exactly. Always good to double check things.
Right. And then there's the computational cost. LLMs in particular need so much power to run.
Yeah, that's a barrier for smaller organizations or individuals.
Even with those more efficient training methods.
It's a trade-off, capability versus accessibility.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from the technical details of knowledge distillation to the bigger picture stuff about AI and society.
It's been a great discussion.
It really has. And I think it sets us up nicely for our final part where we can talk about what's next, what the future holds for LLMs and SLMs.
I'm looking forward to it. There's so much to explore.
It's amazing to think about how far we've come with these models and, all the possibilities they hold.
Yeah, it really feels like we're just getting started.
Exactly. We've talked about the challenges, but I'm really curious about those new frontiers you mentioned.
Oh, there's so much cool stuff happening.
What's on the horizon? What are researchers excited about?
One area that's really captured everyone's imagination is multimodal AI.
Okay, I've heard that term, but I'm not totally sure what it means.
So it's basically combining different modalities like text, images, audio.
Ah, interesting.
Imagine a model that can not only understand and generate text, but also, like, analyze images, compose music, even control robots.
That sounds pretty futuristic.
It does,
Yeah.
right? But it's closer than you might think.
Really?
Yeah, researchers are already doing some amazing things like image captioning, where the model describes what's happening in a picture,
Wow.
or text-to-image generation, where you give it a description and it creates an image,
That's incredible.
and even video understanding, where the model can, analyze what's going on in a video.
So what kind of real-world applications could we see with this multimodal AI?
Oh, the possibilities are endless. Imagine a search engine that understands not just your words, but also pictures and videos.
Okay, yeah.
You could search for, say, recipes with blueberries, and it would show you text recipes, videos of people baking, pictures of blueberry pies.
That would be so cool.
Right. Or in healthcare, multimodal AI could analyze medical images along with patient data to give doctors a more complete picture.
It sounds like it could revolutionize so many industries.
It really could. And this is just one example of the innovation that's happening.
Amazing. Now, you also mentioned LLM security,
Right, that's another crucial area.
because as these models get more powerful, we need to make sure they're being used safely.
Exactly. We don't want them falling into the wrong hands.
So what kind of security threats are we talking about?
Well, there are a few different types. Andrej Karpathy gave a great presentation on this, talking about things like prompt injection, data poisoning, backdoor attacks.
Okay, those sound a little scary.
Yeah, they can be pretty serious. Prompt injection, for example, is where someone tricks the model into running harmful code by hiding it within a normal-looking prompt.
Oh, wow.
And data poisoning is where someone messes with the training data to try to make the model behave differently.
So it's like hacking, but for AI.
Exactly. And it's a growing concern. But luckily, researchers are developing ways to protect against these attacks.
Oh, good. What kind of defenses are there?
One approach is called adversarial training, where you expose the model to all kinds of attack scenarios during training so it learns to defend itself.
So you're basically training it to be more resilient.
Right. It's like giving it a self-defense class.
I like that analogy.
It's a constant battle.
Yeah.
Attackers are always trying to find new ways to exploit these models, and defenders are working to stay one step ahead.
Well, I have to say, this whole deep dive has been incredible.
Me too.
We've learned so much, from the basics to these really cutting-edge advancements.
It's been a wild ride.
It really has. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that these technologies are tools. They could be used for good or bad.
Right.
It's up to us to make sure they're used responsibly.
That's such an important point.
We all have a responsibility to be informed and to participate in this conversation about the future of AI.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
To our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of LLMs and SLMs. Keep learning, keep exploring. The future is full of possibilities.
It really is.